Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Week 2. Fascinating matchup in the ACC. Georgia Tech heading on the road to play Syracuse, and I don't think nearly enough people are talking about this matchup in the landscape of the ACC, where you kind of look at the preseason projections. A lot of people had Florida State, Miami, and Clemson. You look at Florida State and say, that's a disaster right now. You look at Clemson and say, they certainly don't scare you like they did 5 years ago. I think the Miami Hurricanes are pretty damn good. But then you take a look at some of the other dark horses, some of those tier two teams in the ACC, at least to the preseason expectations. Virginia Tech, they lost outright to Vanderbilt on the road last week. NC State played with their food for 3 quarters against an FCS program. I look at Georgia Tech and Syracuse and say, these are two teams that are kind of just being sneaky in this conference. And I would even go and start this episode with a little bit of a hotter take, and that is Haynes King and Kyle McCord might be some of the better quarterbacks that you see in this conference. Kyle McCord is a guy that I just thought was criminally underrated heading into 2024, where he played very good football in 2023. And quite frankly, I think there's a lot of Power Four programs that would want Kyle McCord starting for them at quarterback. And then you look at Haynes King and say, look, Haynes King led the ACC in passing touchdowns last year. Haynes King is an extremely dynamic quarterback that can do a lot of different things. The bugaboo with Haynes King was turning the football over. You take a look at Haynes King throughout the first 2 weeks, only one turnover-worthy play in the first 2 games of the season. If Haynes King cleans up some of the turnovers, this is another really fun quarterback in the ACC. So not only these teams, but I think these quarterbacks kind of getting slept on heading into 2024. This game is going to teach us and kind of let us learn a lot about both of these programs. Really excited to get into some key matchups, some key players to look at. Now, before we do, and as always, number one, and most importantly, let it fly in the comment section. There are a lot of different ways you can go about seeing this football game. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section. Of course, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. I think two teams that are fascinating, two teams that we're going to talk a lot about over the next couple of weeks. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with the matchup that I think has me most intrigued, and that is this Georgia Tech rushing attack versus Syracuse defense that really struggled to stop the run against Ohio in week 1. And you look at Georgia Tech, and I think more importantly, offensive coordinator Buster Faulkner, he's one of the best in the business. You talk about a future head coach. I think Buster Faulkner is going to be one. And I think most importantly, he is, for lack of better terms, kind of brilliant at scheming up a rushing attack. And he has the pieces to do so. And I think it starts with the offensive line, just an experienced group that you kind of saw go out there in Ireland and kind of push around a Florida State defensive line that we thought was going to be really good. Now, I think one of the more fascinating conversations is how do we evaluate Georgia Tech with Florida State just not even looking good against Boston College. So that kind of throws a wrench in terms of how we evaluate Georgia Tech. But regardless, this was one of the better rushing attacks we saw in the country last year. It's still one of the better rushing attacks this year. And Buster Faulkner's so good at running the football in so many different ways, right? You have a dynamic quarterback in Haynes King who can certainly get it done on the ground. You got one of the better running backs in the ACC in Jamal Haynes. And then you got a bunch of different like X factor playmakers, guys like Eric Singleton Jr., Malik Rutherford. I look at this matchup and say, how does Syracuse stop this Georgia Tech rushing attack? On top of that, I think Syracuse best defender, Marlowe Wax, he's going to miss the football game. And so I got some big question marks about Syracuse stopping the run. And if they do want to allocate a lot of bodies into the box, walk down their safeties, I think Haynes King has the ability to make Syracuse pay working vertically in the passing attack. And so I look at that matchup and say that's probably the most important matchup that you're looking at in this football game. Now you transition to the Syracuse offense. Kyle McCord looked great. You talk about a quarterback that is not always going to be the most flashy, but just makes the good right decisions. He is very quick to get the football out of his hands. He's an extremely accurate passer. That's what Kyle McCord is, and there's not really a throw that he can't make. Kyle McCord balances, hey, I'm going to take what's there from the defense, but also make some of those draw-dropping throws. He has that ability, and he certainly looked the part against Ohio. And on top of Kyle McCord, Syracuse has another very experienced offensive line that has a ton of seniors and redshirt juniors. And then on the outside, legitimate difference makers. right? LaQuint Allen, phenomenal running back. Aronde Gaston, one of the better pass catchers in all of the country. You're bringing Zeke Haynes through the transfer portal. A guy like Pena looks very, very good. I mean, Kyle McCord, I think, is a very good quarterback that has a solid offensive line in front of him and some legitimate difference makers on the outside. Now, I think the real question mark is how good and how much improved is this Georgia Tech defense, where we were sitting 2 weeks ago after that Florida State game and said, Tyler Santucci has completely revolutionized this Georgia Tech defense after week 0 against Florida State. Now, Florida State's offense doesn't look nearly as good as we thought it was going to be in the preseason. That being said, I think this Georgia Tech defense is still much improved from last year. I think the question is how much improved are they? And I think we're going to find out against Syracuse. One of the I think underrated aspects about a defensive coordinator is that defensive coordinators can really change defenses in one offseason. We've seen it done multiple different times. Like Michigan had a defensive coordinator change in 2021, went from being a middle tier defense to one of the best defenses in the country. You look at what USC just did with Dan Lynn, what they did against LSU, completely transitioned this defense. There's a real, especially in this transfer portal era, where not only can you change your defensive coordinator and scheme, but also get the players necessary to get this defense better. You can overhaul and change a defense, I think, a lot more than people give credit for in one offseason. Now, the question is, did Tyler Santucci do that for this Georgia Tech defense? We're going to find that out against Syracuse. Romello Height, I think, is a legitimate difference maker in the pass rush. And, Kyle McCord is not a quarterback that deals with pressure all that well because he ain't a great athlete. And so if Romello Height can be a difference maker coming off the edge for Georgia Tech, I think that's a key factor. And you got guys in the back. I think the secondary is much improved. They tackle in space well. They're very sticky. LaMiles Brooks in the back end can turn the football over. I think this Georgia Tech defense is better. I think the question is how much better are they? And so you get into the pick here, and again, I don't feel great about either of these sides, but I'm going to go Georgia Tech because I do think Georgia Tech will be able to. There's something that I think Georgia Tech can do that I think can really change this game, and that is run the football. Like when you have the ability to run the football, keep your offense on the field, keep Kyle McCord on the bench, and kind of control this game on the ground, I think that's really going to help Georgia Tech. And because they're two-dimensional, and I think Haynes King can push the ball down the field, he has difference makers on the outside. I'm going to lean with Georgia Tech, especially with the absence of Marlo Wax, who I think is one of the better linebackers that we see in the ACC. So give me Georgia Tech as a road favorite in the JMA Wireless. As a Western New York guy, I'm just going to call it the Carrier Dome still. Watched a lot of games there when I was a kid. I'm going to go Georgia Tech. I don't feel great about betting against a Syracuse team that I think is much improved, has a lot of juice. I expect it to be very rowdy in the Dome this weekend, but I'm going to go Georgia Tech. Again, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.